Good morning, Lions and Emperors. Let's go ahead and pray. David Livingston's going to take up some time today. Father, as we walk through the life of David Livingston, may you be pleased, glorified, to show us the heart of the man who has such a legend around him. And I pray that we too would have a desire to see the gospel spread, even if what we do only lays the foundation for what future generations will do. Let us all work together as the family across generations to see you glorified in all nations. I love you. It's in your name I pray, Lord. Amen. This is David Livingston, Part 2. It really was a lovely Zambezi river basin, but it was also known as the River of Human Misery. The reason for this is because it linked the Portuguese colonies in Angola and Mozambique, which were countries that were the primary source of slaves to Brazil, and later to Cuba and the United States. We hear a lot about the English slave trade and American slave trade, but the Portuguese, they were the masters of it back in that day. Slaves from Africa's interior were composed of women, children, prisoners of war, and famine refugees. They were captured. They were sent down the Zambezi River to the coast for shipment. David would sometimes meet up with groups that had 100 chained and shackled persons headed to the sea. He had several motives for his explorations. One was missions, obviously. But he was also an envoy for Great Britain, expanding the territorial claims for England, despite the repeated protests from the Crown of England, no, we don't want African colonies. He was also on the lookout, letter B, for fertile, well-watered highland, because that would take away from the area where the tsetse flies were, and the malaria that was so prevalent in that area. He wanted to find a place where he could put a mission station, but it had to be in a safer place than the Zambezi provided. He recorded much of the data on natural resources, coal, mineral deposits, forests, and animals. That was to be used to put a good mission station in, and ended up being a reason for the government to come in and look for these resources themselves. Letter C, mostly he wanted to end the slave trade in Africa. He believed that Christian commerce would be the key, that didn't require slaves. He hoped to replace the inefficient slave economy with capitalism. The tribes were more willing to engage in legitimate commerce. They had no problem with trading with the white folks. They just didn't want to be slaves. Who could blame them? David financed his missions trips with the trading of goods. For instance, he would trade guns for bronze. Then he would trade bronze for elephant tusks. He would trade tusks for slaves, whom he then set free. And then he would take the leftover ivory for sale to the coast. And he funded missions in that way. He envisioned that this economy would be transformed into one of cotton, coffee, and sugar, which would grow awesomely in that river basin, if only somebody would catch the vision for it. In 1856, in December, David completed a cross-continental journey, but he was in great pain and afflicted with malaria. He returned to England very discouraged. For 3 years, England and Russia had been fighting a very nightmarish war called the Crimean War. You can read a little bit about this in Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. If you're not familiar with that, it's the one that says, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Why do I know that? I had to memorize it in 6th grade. Crazy what those teachers in 6th grade accomplished. Here I am, an old man, and I still remember at least some of the lines from that poem. England desperately needed heroes, and in essence, David Livingston became their rock star. He was given medals. He was given an honorary doctorate from Oxford. He wrote a 400-page book called Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. That crazy book is still in print, and it's used by several universities for courses on the pre-colonial history of Africa. Go figure, a Christian man. Livingston made more than 120 times what his annual London Missionary Society salary was. The book royalties is where he got all that money. David's relationship with the London Missionary Society weakened, and they thought that he should give up his many exploratory trips in exchange for more normal missions like Moffat had. Remember, Moffat wasn't really doing a whole lot of missions, so I don't think we want any more missionaries like that. David said that his trips were missionary travels, preparing God's highway for those who would follow later. He had a vision that maybe this mission was going to take him several generations to accomplish. He would start it, but he wanted to make sure that things were in place so that others could follow in his footsteps. He eventually would separate from the London Missionary Society when they wanted him to disciple a new group of missionaries. Again, why take me off the mission field? There's other people who could disciple those missionaries. I want to go where Christ is not named. David had only planned to help them get to the mission station, not to be their professor of missions. The British government then hired him to lead a voyage of discovery upon the Zambezi River, which is another lesson for another day when the coronavirus has not taken up so much of our time. In 1858, in March, David and Mary, pregnant again, by the way, congrats, Mary, one of their children and the exploring team headed out. They traveled upriver in a small steamboat for about 1,000 miles until they got to Victoria Falls, which we left off at yesterday. They built a mission station for the university's mission to Central Africa, the UMCA. Not quite as popular known as the YMCA. This is the UMCA. Okay, never mind. Along with literally tons of supplies, they carried a prefabricated iron house to set up there. Iron's kind of heavy, but boy, I tell you what, you put up a house made of iron, you're probably not going to have a lot of problems with that house being blown over. Their boat was also state-of-the-art technology, but it was a little bit too fragile for the old Zambezi River. It used so much wood in the boiler and frequent running aground on sandbars that it caused it to leak badly. Good ship, just wasn't made for the Zambezi. The journey pushed the crew to the brink of human endurance. Again, another story for another day. In 1862, Mary, who had just given birth to her 6th child, died on the shore of the Zambezi River. And abruptly, David completely changed course with the UMCA team. They wanted to establish a malaria-free colony of free slaves in the cool, fertile Shire River Valley. The Shire. Unfortunately, a tribal war, a severe drought, and Arab slave traders were depopulating the land. They were finding far fewer people in this area than they thought they would. The Zambezi expedition, a nightmare from the beginning, now got worse. In 1864, the British government ended the ill-fated expedition, and he returned to London sick, discouraged, depressed, lonely as all get out, having lost a wife and child. He published another book, a narrative of the expedition to the Zambezi and its tributaries, again funding future missions. A year later, in 1865, he returned to Africa to lead an expedition for the Royal Geographic Society to discover the source of the Nile, which was the main geographical puzzle of David's time. It's hard for us to imagine with satellites and GPS and all kinds of Google Maps and stuff. It's hard for us to imagine that there was a time when this was not able to be known. You had to go there, and you had to go the entire distance to figure it out. With only 30 members in his team, which included porters and Indian soldiers, freed slave boys, and a few local men, none of whom were white. Most of them deserted him, except for a few faithful men like Chuma and Susi, slaves that he had set free 10 years before, and they loved him and stayed with him. The deserters spread rumors that Livingston had been murdered. Rescue teams were sent to find him, and for 2 years he simply disappeared into unknown locations without any word. No rumors, nothing. It was like he dropped off the face of the planet. He said later he had been so ill he could not even lift a pen, but in that 2 years' time, he read through the Bible 4 times. 4 times in 2 years. Let's all join him in that. Amen. Livingston's disappearance fascinated the public, just like Amelia Earhart's disappearance in the 1930s. Where did she go? What happened? It's so mysterious. We don't know where they went. And so finally, the New York newspaper sent a guy named Henry Stanley to go searching on the Nile River, trying to find David Livingston. And some of you are familiar with this. When Henry Stanley walked into that location, he walked into that field, he walked up to him. 1872, he walked up and he shook David's hand and he said, "Dr. Livingston, I presume." If you have not heard that before, you're probably really young. But if your parents are watching this video, they probably know exactly what I'm talking about. It's one of the most famous statements in history. Dr. Livingston, I presume. And it had to do with a missionary who was looking for the source of the Nile. When an American journalist, Henry Stanley, found him, the news exploded in England and America. Newspapers carried special editions devoted to the famous meeting between them. But he never did find out the source of the Nile. He missed it by about 200 miles. Again, 200 miles sounds like a long way, but when you think about the Nile River being the longest river in the world, you've got the Blue Nile and the White Nile. And so you've got a lot of expedition. If he only missed it by 200 miles, he also traveled 2,000 some miles on that river. In 1873, in January, he had to be carried through the swamp that came up to Susi's mouth, and it wetted my seat and legs. When my porter sank into a deep elephant's footprint, he required 2 men to lift him out. They only traveled 1.5 miles a day. 1.5 miles. From my present location, right behind BCS, a mile is pretty much from BCS over to Culver's. So can you imagine traveling that distance, maybe a little bit more, maybe down to, I don't know, Dunkin' Donut, or maybe over to Walmart from BCS. If you're not familiar with these locations, don't worry about it. It's for my students anyway. Anyway, if you can imagine only traveling that far in one day, that's how difficult the terrain in the jungle was. On May the 1st, 1873, David Livingston died after evading death so many times. Chuma and Susi found a blood clot several inches long obstructing his small intestine, evidence that his death had been hastened by internal bleeding. Imagine doing an autopsy in the middle of the jungle. They wrapped and dried his body in the sun to preserve it for the long trip back home, except for one part of him. They took his heart out. Chuma and Susi took out his heart, and they buried it in Africa because they said that his heart belonged to the continent that he loved so much. That never fails to get me. Maybe they'll bury my heart in Bradenton. In June, the British forced the Sultan of Zanzibar to close the largest slave market in East Africa, partly because of David Livingstone's efforts. Near Moffat Station in Kuruman, the largest gold and diamond deposits in the world were found, and all of a sudden that mission station had more people than it knew what to do with. Colonialism carved up Africa into British, Portuguese, French, German, and Belgian colonies. Livingston inspired generations of men, women, and children even to missions work throughout Africa. Livingston is still respected in Africa despite the modern Africans' animosity toward most other Europeans. For instance, the cities of Livingston in Zambia and Livingstonia in Malawi still bear his name, an Englishman's name in pride. The capital of Malawi, Blantyre, is named for Livingston's birthplace. And Livingston's massive bronze statue still points to the world's largest waterfall, Victoria Falls. Love that story. I hope you do too. Brothers and sisters, we'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.